In the summer of 2000, an indie rock band from the Pacific Northwest quietly released a record that sounded like it was beamed in from another planet. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was cosmic, cracked, and completely unlike anything else. This is the story of how Modest Mouse, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, a major label deal, and a literal broken jaw, created the Moon and Antarctica, a frozen masterpiece that still feels like a transmission from somewhere far beyond. This is what happens when you give a band complete creative freedom, and they use it to explore the edges of the universe. Hi, this is Waffles. I'm Andy Fenstermaker, host of Poetic Wax, a weekly music history series and podcast where I dig into the record collection I've been building since the 1990s and explore the sometimes little-known history of a band, album, or song from within. In the year 2000, Modest Mouse released what would become one of the most quietly groundbreaking albums of the 21st century so far, The Moon and Antarctica. It was a record that projected its own distorted constellation across the musical landscape. Cold, cosmic, cerebral, yet deeply human. These are the stories behind that album, the personal pain, the philosophical weight, and the strange journey that took one of indie rock's most feral voices from the woods of the Pacific Northwest into the void of deep space. In 1999, Modest Mouse signed to Epic Records, a major label. For fans who had fallen in love with the band's earlier albums like Lonesome Crowded West, the move felt like a potential betrayal. Could a band so rooted in DIY ethics survive the machinery of corporate music? But Isaac Brock, the band's frontman, had his own philosophy. He wasn't interested in compromise. He wanted tools, more recording time, better equipment. The label could give him that. And as long as he retained creative control, he didn't care who paid the bills. After all, before Modest Mouse made the jump, others had tested those waters. Nirvana's move to Geffen changed everything, while Sonic Youth and REM had proven that you could carry indie spirit into major label territory without losing your soul. Even fellow Pacific Northwest artist Built to Spill had made the leap, quietly and reservedly pumping out albums that still rang true to their indie roots. Still, the fear lingered. Major label deals had a way of sanding off the rough edges, of diluting the weird into the marketable. But The Moon and Antarctica ended up being the opposite of a sellout album. It was experimental, alienating, and expansive, epic in both name and nature. That tension between artistic purity and commercial reach, it set the stage for a creative leap, not just in industry terms, but in imagination. The band's gaze shifted upward and outward, far beyond their Pacific Northwest roots. Where Modest Mouse's earlier work dwelled in the wooded sprawl of Pacific Northwest, highways, diners, small-town malaise, The Moon and Antarctica floated far beyond the terrestrial. This record asked bigger questions. Why are we here? What comes next? Does anything even matter? Does it, Waffles? Take The Stars Are Projectors, a sprawling 7-minute track that turns the universe into a projection screen for our own anxieties. Or Lives, which considers reincarnation with a sardonic shrug. The mood is philosophical yet rarely pretentious. Brock wasn't claiming to know the answers, he was just determined to ask better questions. Even the title, The Moon and Antarctica, feels like a riddle, albeit hard to say. Two desolate places, unreachable and unknowable, beautiful but cold. One of the most persistent legends about The Moon and Antarctica is that Isaac Brock recorded the vocals with his jaw wired shut. It's a gripping image, a man quite literally clenching his way through existential dread. But the truth, as Brock clarified in a 2020 interview with Spin, is a little less dramatic. But he had broken his jaw. According to Brian Deck, who produced the album, quote, "It was a real changing point. It was the first day of recording real vocals. I went home and Isaac and a couple other people went to the Empty Bottle. They came home late to the apartment and parked his van next to the city park across the corner. It was very late at night, and he struck up a conversation with some people, and someone punched him in the jaw and broke his jaw. He was certainly not trying to pick a fight. When it came time to return to the studio for overdubs and vocals, his jaw was no longer wired shut. 6 weeks after the initial incident. The pain, however, still lingered, along with the emotional weight of the incident. So while you won't hear the literal struggle of a wired jaw on the album, there is still a tension in the vocals, a rawness that suggests a man physically and psychologically bruised. In the end, the broken jaw story might be more useful as a metaphor than fact, a symbol of how pain and pressure shaped an album that still sounds like like it's holding something back and letting it leak through the cracks. Behind the boards, once again, was producer Brian Deck, known for his work with bands like Caliphone and Red Red Meat. He brought a textured, often organic approach to production. Deck helped the band use the studio as an instrument. Instead of a raw, lo-fi sound like their earlier albums, the Moon and Antarctica is filled with strange flourishes. Backwoods drum loops, ambient static, pitch-warped guitars. Clava Studios in Chicago became a laboratory. Deck would later describe the sessions as experimental and immersive. One of the most striking examples is Alone Down There, where Brock's vocals are filtered and warped, making him sound like he's trapped inside a vacuum. This was Modest Mouse at their most sonically ambitious, yet it never feels overproduced. It's lush, but not glossy, haunted, but never hollow. Pausing for a quick moment of self-promotion. Poetic Wax can be found on YouTube, on your favorite podcast platforms, on TikTok, and on Substack. I'd love it if you followed me in multiple places. You can also join the weekly newsletter where I get a little bit more personal at poeticwaxpodcast.com/join. Released in June of 2000, The Moon and Antarctica feels like a record made after the fall of the Twin Towers, not before. There's a tension running through it, a sense that something is broken and can't be put back together. Lyrics like "the universe is shaped exactly like the earth. If you go straight long enough, you end up where you were," echo a spiritual exaltation that would only become more widespread in the coming years. This was an album composed during the quiet dread of Y2K and the tail end of a decade that had promised technological bliss but delivered unease. Its release coincided with the dot-com bubble bursting, when Silicon Valley's dreams of boundless growth were literally collapsing under their own weight, mirroring the album's themes of disappointment and disillusionment. Themes of disconnection and fragmentation ran rampant. In The Cold Part, Brock sings about emotional isolation. There's an eerily predictive quality about these lyrics that speak to digital age alienation and the slow decay of intimacy. The album also explores the hollowness of routine and repetition. Tracks like Paper Thin Walls point to social rituals and the tension between public persona and private collapse. It's not a protest record, but it is a bit of a warning sign, a slow-moving alarm about the numbness creeping into culture. This is why the album resonates so deeply with people even today. It predicted the existential fatigue of the 2000s and 2010s with eerie accuracy, and perhaps more strikingly, it did so without ever claiming to have a solution. The album opens with Third Planet, and it wastes no time going existential. Your heart felt good. It was dripping pitch and made of wood. It's an anti-love song, a meditation of death, and even a cosmic lament, all rolled into one. The gentle acoustic guitar gives it a folk-like quality, but its lyrics are anything but gentle. And yet, it never quite feels hopeless. There's a warmth to the melancholy, a sort of resigned beauty. Then there's Gravity Rides Everything. In 2001, Modest Mouse allowed Volkswagen to use the song in a commercial. For a band that had resisted mainstream conventions, it felt jarring. Fans called it a sellout move. Isaac Brock later said he regretted it, admitting that it felt gross. But it also revealed the central tension of being a working musician. How do you survive without compromising your values. It's the same tension that underlies the entire album. Gravity Rides Everything itself is one of the more melodic and accessible tracks on the record. Ironically, its use in the ad brought new listeners to a band that was otherwise buried deep in indie territory. So, if that's accessible, what genre is the Moon and Antarctica? Indie rock? Psychedelic folk? Postmodern space country? Doesn't quite fit anywhere. There are banjos on some tracks, analog synths on others. There's spiritual kinship with bands like Sparkle Horse or maybe even early Pink Floyd if you stretch a bit, but also with classic Americana. This is cosmic folk. It speaks of stars, but it wears flannel. It At its core, it remains deeply personal. Songs like Wild Packs of Family Dogs tell eerie suburban ghost stories, while Perfect Disguise turns emotional detachment into poetry. Before Float On catapulted Modest Mouse into mainstream fame, the Moon and Antarctica built the foundation for the band's most loyal fans. This is the album that people... Hey, stop that. This is the album that people play alone on long drives, searching for meaning in headlights and silence. Its critical reception was strong. Pitchfork gave it a 9.8, but its true success came in the slow burn. Word of mouth. Burned CDs. Napster downloads. College dorm stereos at 3 a.m. It was a place you could go, not physically, but mentally. One listener described it as, quote, the sound of being stuck in your own head while the universe expands outside your window. That kind of intimacy can't be faked. Originally, Brock considered naming it Everywhere in his Nasty Parlor Tricks, a phrase that would later be used for an EP of outtakes from the sessions. But he landed on The Moon and Antarctica. And honestly, it's a perfect title. Icy, isolated, mysterious. It reflects not only the album's soundscape, but its emotional terrain. It suggests vastness and the sense of, well, that no matter how far you travel, you may never reach warmth. And yet, the album does offer comfort. Not through answers, but through solidarity. You're not alone in feeling lost. You're not alone in asking big, unanswerable questions. And now, more than 25 years later, The Moon and Antarctica still feels well ahead of its time. It's not an album that aged into relevance. It was always relevant, but for many of us, we just needed time to catch up. This remains a cosmic map drawn by a man with his jaw wired shut, trying to make sense of a world he never quite trusted. And maybe in that tension between silence and scream, space and spirit, lies its true genius.